The bright California sun beat down on the city of Los Angeles, its rays gleaming off the shiny exteriors of the luxury cars lined up in front of the dealership. The sprawling showroom, tucked in one of the most affluent parts of the city, exuded an air of exclusivity and wealth. Inside, the cool air contrasted with the warmth of the day, but the ambience was far from welcoming. It was the kind of place where the elite, the CEOs, and the celebrities strolled in without a second thought, flashing their cash for the right to own a symbol of status. But today, something was different. As the doors of the dealership swung open, a woman stepped in, her presence commanding attention in an instant. Her name was Tasha Thompson, and though she was dressed in an elegant black blazer and crisp white shirt, the way she held herself, the strength in her step, spoke volumes about who she was. Tasha wasn't just another customer looking to purchase a car, she was a force to be reckoned with. Someone who had earned her place in this world, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. Tasha's striking appearance did not go unnoticed. Her dark brown skin shimmered under the showroom lights, and her short, sleek hair framed her face in a way that highlighted her sharp, intelligent eyes. She moved with purpose, her gaze scanning the room, looking at the luxury cars that surrounded her, a Ferrari, the latest model of a Tesla Roadster, and a row of sparkling Mercedes-Benz vehicles. These machines were more than just transportation, they were status symbols for those who could afford them. As Tasha walked further into the showroom, a receptionist sitting behind the desk barely looked up, her cold, blue eyes flicking over Tasha before returning to her computer. It was as if Tasha hadn't even entered the space, as if she were invisible. The dismissive look on the receptionist's face stung. But Tasha didn't flinch. She knew this game all too well. This silent underestimation that came from people who believed they were entitled to their positions because of their wealth or appearance. A man in a navy suit approached her. His slicked back hair and polished appearance spoke of someone used to getting what they wanted. His name was James Weston, one of the senior sales associates at the dealership. He flashed her a polite but condescending smile, though Tasha could tell from the way his eyes glanced at her that he had already decided who she was and what she could afford. "Can I help you, ma'am?" James asked, his tone a mix of politeness and skepticism. Tasha smiled back, her voice calm and unwavering. "Yes, I'm interested in the new Mercedes-AMG GT." James's smile widened, but there was something in the way his eyes darted around, seeking confirmation from his colleagues that told a different story. He glanced over his shoulder to where a few of the other salespeople were gathered, their whispers filling the air. "That's quite a car," James said, a hint of sarcasm creeping into his voice. "Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more practical?" He chuckled, his colleagues behind him joining in the mockery. Tasha felt the heat rise in her chest, a familiar sense of anger flaring up. But she didn't let it show. She had dealt with these moments before, people underestimating her, judging her based on nothing but appearances. She had earned her way to this point, and no one was going to make her feel small. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself. "I'm sure," she said firmly, her voice steady and calm. "I'd like to test drive it, if possible." James's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a split second, Tasha could see the hesitation in his eyes. He quickly masked it with a polite smile, but she could tell he was already calculating how to dismiss her. "I'm afraid that won't be possible without proper verification," he said, dragging out the last word just enough for Tasha to feel its weight. She could feel the eyes of the other salespeople on her now, their gazes full of judgment and curiosity. She had experienced moments like this before, being doubted, being questioned simply because of the color of her skin. But Tasha wasn't one to back down. Not now, not ever. Her gaze locked with James's. Unblinking. Verification, she echoed, her voice cutting through the silence that had settled in the showroom. Tasha's heart beat a little faster as she felt the tension in the air. She could sense James's discomfort as he looked to his colleagues for support. But none came. She wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. "Yes," James said with a tight smile. "It's just policy. We can't let anyone test drive a vehicle like that without verifying their ability to pay for it first." The words hit her like a slap in the face. She knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't about policy. It was about him assuming that someone like her, a black woman, couldn't possibly afford a car like the AMG GT. She had dealt with this kind of discrimination her whole life. But today, it was going to stop. "Is that so?" Tasha asked, her voice ice cold. "Well, I think I've heard enough." James shifted uneasily on his feet as Tasha straightened her posture, standing taller and more resolute. The murmur of conversation behind her faded as she took a deliberate step forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "I'll be test driving that car today," she said, louder this time, her words clear and unwavering. James's face faltered. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered when Tasha raised a hand to silence him. "And I'll be doing it with someone who understands how to treat potential clients," she continued, her tone firm and unyielding. The silence in the showroom was deafening. Every eye was on her now, and Tasha could feel the weight of their stares. But she didn't back down. She wasn't going to let these people get away with disrespecting her. "Mom," James said, his voice tight with barely contained frustration. "I don't think you understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Tasha interrupted. "What I don't understand is how a luxury dealership in Los Angeles, a city that prides itself on diversity, allows its employees to make assumptions based on someone's appearance." Tasha's words hung in the air like a challenge. She didn't wait for James to respond. She was done with his excuses. As she spoke, a man appeared at the far end of the showroom, stepping out from behind a glass office. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, and his suit screamed authority. Stephen Carter, the general manager of the dealership, had finally arrived. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice smooth but with a hint of concern. Before James could speak, Tasha took control of the situation. "The problem, Mr. Carter," she said, turning to face him directly, "is that I came here to buy a car. A luxury car, and your employees have made it abundantly clear that they don't think I belong here." Stephen's eyes flicked from James to Tasha, the tension in the room palpable. Tasha could see the calculation in his eyes. This was his chance to salvage the situation. But would he? The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Tasha stood her ground, unwavering, as Stephen Carter, the general manager, sized her up. For a brief moment, he seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking over to James, whose face had already turned crimson from the uncomfortable scrutiny. James opened his mouth, but Stephen silenced him with a quick glance. "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding, Miss Thompson," Stephen said, his voice calm but measured. "We aim for excellence in customer service here, and I'm certain there has been some miscommunication." "James, please step aside." James hesitated but eventually backed off, his face flushed with embarrassment as he walked away. Tasha could see that the confidence he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced with a nervousness that he couldn't quite hide. "I'll handle this from here," Stephen continued, his tone still smooth but now carrying a hint of urgency. Let's go to my office. And I'll personally ensure that this matter is resolved. Please follow me. Tasha nodded, her expression unreadable as she followed Stephen through the showroom, her heels clicking sharply against the sleek tiles. She could feel the eyes of the other salespeople on her. The whispered conversations no longer laced with mockery but with uncertainty. There was no doubt in her mind that her stand had already made an impact. But she wasn't finished yet. As they reached Stephen's office, the glass walls offering a panoramic view of the showroom, Tasha could feel the weight of the eyes on her. The door clicked shut behind them, and Stephen motioned for her to take a seat. He sat across from her, his face now more open, the polished corporate mask slipping just slightly. "Miss Thompson," Stephen began, his voice softer now, "I want to assure you that this will be addressed. Our dealership values all customers, regardless of background or appearance. I'll make sure this never happens again." Tasha didn't take the bait. She wasn't interested in empty apologies. She was here for more than just an apology. She wanted change. "I don't just want an apology, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady and firm. "I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. It's not just about me. It's about the way your team treats people who walk in here expecting respect, regardless of who they are." Stephen leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed her words. For a moment, he was silent, as though weighing the situation. The silence stretched, and Tasha remained resolute, her gaze unwavering. "You're right," Stephen finally said, his voice thoughtful. "We have had issues in the past, but nothing like this. I'll personally see to it that the staff undergoes further training on how to treat every customer with the respect they deserve." Tasha raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Training isn't enough, Mr. Carter. This kind of behavior isn't just a mistake, it's systemic. I want to make sure your dealership adopts a policy that holds people accountable when they cross the line. And I want to know how you plan to enforce it." Stephen's face twitched, his professional demeanor slipping just a little. He hadn't anticipated this level of scrutiny, but Tasha's calm resolve had him on the defensive. She wasn't just a woman buying a car, she was a force. And she wasn't going to let the issues slide under the rug. "Look, I understand," Stephen said, rubbing his temples briefly. "We can implement new policies. Sure, but this will take time. It's not going to be an overnight fix." Tasha didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for overnight change, Mr. Carter, but I do expect concrete steps. First, I want a full apology to be made to the employees who mocked me. And I want those employees to be held accountable for their actions. Second, I want to be involved in the development of these policies to ensure that they're effective. And third, most importantly, I want to be reassured that this kind of behavior is not tolerated in your dealership." Stephen's shoulders slumped, but he nodded. "I'll make sure we follow through. I'll personally make it happen." Tasha's eyes softened, but she didn't let her guard down. She had gotten what she needed, but the road ahead would still require vigilance. "Good," Tasha said, her tone finally relaxing. "Now, let's talk about that test drive. Blank, underscore, blank." Stephen's demeanor shifted again, his face brightening with the realization that the immediate crisis had been averted. He motioned for his assistant to bring the keys to the Mercedes-AMG GT. Tasha could sense the shift in power. The tension had melted away, replaced by an almost palpable sense of relief on Stephen's part. The wheels were in motion, but Tasha knew it was far from over. Within minutes, a young associate appeared with the keys in hand, his demeanor a stark contrast to James's earlier arrogance. He was calm and professional, a marked difference from the smugness that had initially permeated the room. Tasha took the keys from him with a nod, her gaze briefly meeting Stephen's. As she stepped out of the office and into the sunlight, the sleek black Mercedes-AMG GT sat waiting for her like a coiled animal, its polished surface gleaming under the California sun. Tasha ran her fingers along the car's flawless paint, feeling the power beneath her touch. She could hear the subtle hum of the engine, eager to be unleashed. James and the other sales associates watched from inside the showroom, their faces a mixture of disbelief and forced neutrality. Tasha knew that they hadn't expected her to be so resolute, but she wasn't done yet. The test drive was hers to take, and nothing, no condescension, no dismissive attitudes, was going to take that from her. With a turn of the key, the engine roared to life, and Tasha felt a surge of triumph as the car responded to her touch, its power effortlessly gliding through the streets of Los Angeles. The showroom had fallen silent, but she could feel the eyes of her onlookers, now filled with awe, tracking her every move. She handled the car with the grace and confidence that came from years of hard work, the road ahead hers to command. When she returned to the dealership, parking the car as effortlessly as she had driven it, she saw Stephen standing at the entrance, waiting. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps respect, in his eyes. "Well?" he asked, his voice neutral but with a hint of curiosity. Tasha stepped out of the car, meeting his gaze. "I'll take it," she said simply. Stephen's relief was palpable, but there was something else in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons that had been learned. "I'll have the paperwork ready." Tasha smiled faintly, knowing that this wasn't just the end of a car purchase. It was the beginning of something bigger. The day had ended, but Tasha knew that her journey was far from over. As she walked out of the dealership with the keys to her brand new Mercedes-AMG GT in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that her actions had set something in motion. The drive home was a blur of city lights and the hum of the powerful engine beneath her. The streets of Los Angeles seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, and with every mile, Tasha felt a growing sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the car, it was about the stand she had taken, the message she had sent. Her phone buzzed in her purse, and she pulled it out to see a series of missed calls and texts. The first was from her best friend, Maya, who had been following her every step of the way. Maya had been her rock through everything, offering support when things got tough. Tasha smiled as she read the text. "I saw the news. I'm so proud of you. Tash, you've made history today. Let's celebrate soon. Sparkling heart." Next, there was a message from Stephen Carter, a number she hadn't expected to hear from again so soon. Her eyebrows arched as she opened the text. "Miss Thompson, I just wanted to thank you again for bringing this issue to light. You've inspired some serious changes here. I'll keep you updated on the progress. Can we meet sometime this week to discuss your involvement? I'd love to have you as part of the team moving forward. Best regards, Stephen." Tasha stared at the message, her lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't expected this. The idea of working with the dealership to ensure lasting change was tempting, but part of her still hesitated. She'd taken a stand, but was she ready to dive deeper into this world, where the lines between business and justice often blurred? Her mind was racing as she pulled up to her apartment, parking the car in her designated spot. The sleek lines of the AMG GT caught the light as she stepped out of the car, and for a moment, she allowed herself to bask in the feeling of victory. But it wasn't just about the car, it was about what the car represented. Tasha had fought not just for herself, but for all the people who were overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because of who they were. The thought filled her with a quiet sense of pride. Inside her apartment, she kicked off her shoes and sank into the plush sofa, her fingers still gripping the keys to the car. The sound of her phone ringing interrupted her thoughts. It was Maya again. "Tasha, I'm watching the news right now. Your story is everywhere. You've gone viral." Maya's voice was filled with excitement, and Tasha could hear the joy in her tone. "They're talking about you on the news. On social media, this is huge." "I didn't expect this," Tasha replied, her voice steady but a little overwhelmed. "I just wanted to buy a car. Maya, I didn't realize it would turn into all of this." "That's the thing, Tash," Maya said. "This is bigger than you. You've opened up a conversation about racism, discrimination, and how the system doesn't always treat people equally. You've sparked something. Don't underestimate the power you have now." Tasha leaned back, her mind turning over Maya's words. She hadn't thought of it that way. What had started as a simple act of standing up for herself had snowballed into something much larger, something that could bring about real change. The next few days were a whirlwind. Tasha's story made headlines across the city, and soon, it spread beyond Los Angeles. Local newspapers ran articles about her experience at the dealership, and social media was abuzz with discussions about the incident. The hashtags #Justice for Tasha and #Change in the dealership were trending. And the story had reached people across the country. Tasha didn't seek out the attention, it had come to her. The media called her a trailblazer, a hero, someone who had challenged the status quo and come out victorious. But Tasha knew that she was just a person who had refused to be intimidated. Her goal had never been to be famous, it was to show others that they didn't have to accept discrimination. A few days later, Tasha met with Stephen Carter at a high-end restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. The sun had just begun to dip below the skyline, casting the city in a warm golden glow. Stephen was already seated when she arrived, his expression a mix of anticipation and unease. He stood when she approached, and they exchanged pleasantries before sitting down. "Thank you for meeting with me, Tasha," Stephen began, his voice respectful. "I've spoken with the team, and we've started implementing new policies and training sessions. We're making sure that this never happens again. I can't tell you how much your visit meant to us. It's been a wake-up call." Tasha nodded, her eyes sharp as she studied him. She could tell he was sincere. But sincerity wasn't enough. "I'm glad to hear that, Stephen, but I want to see it in action. I want to know what concrete steps you're taking. And I want to be part of that process." Stephen's eyes widened, clearly not expecting her to be so direct. But he quickly recovered. "Of course. We've already started the first round of diversity and inclusion training for our staff. And we've begun reviewing all of our internal policies. We're also working with local community leaders to ensure that we're held accountable." Tasha leaned forward, her gaze intense. "And what about the employees involved in the mockery? What happens to them?" Stephen shifted uncomfortably but didn't look away. "They've been reprimanded, some will face disciplinary action, and there will be consequences for those who have made discriminatory remarks. We're taking this very seriously." Tasha's expression softened slightly. "Good. This isn't just about me or about what happened that day. This is about making sure people like me don't have to fight just to be treated like everyone else." "I understand," Stephen said, his voice earnest. "And I want to make sure you're part of the solution. You've already sparked a movement. And we want to ensure that you have a seat at the table as we continue this work." Tasha paused, considering his words. There was something compelling about the offer, something that spoke to her desire to create lasting change. But she had been burned before. Trust wasn't something she gave easily. Still, something told her this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. "I'll do it," Tasha said finally. "I'll help you. But it's not just about your dealership, it's about every business. Every industry. There's a lot of work to be done. And I'm ready to be part of it." Stephen's eyes lit up, relief washing over his features. "Thank you, Tasha. I promise you won't regret it. We're going to make this right." As they continued their conversation, discussing the specifics of her involvement, Tasha felt a sense of purpose settle over her. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning. The road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready for it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Tasha's decision to work alongside Stephen Carter and the dealership's management team had created a storm of change within the company. But as much as she was focused on the work at hand, she couldn't ignore the way her story had impacted the broader community. Her name was no longer just a name, it had become a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of standing up for what was right, and of demanding accountability in spaces where people of color were often made to feel invisible. Tasha had agreed to help the dealership develop new, more inclusive policies. She worked closely with Stephen and his team to revise customer service protocols, ensuring that all employees understood the importance of treating each customer with the same level of respect and dignity, regardless of their background, appearance, or financial status. She also became involved in leading diversity and inclusion training sessions, speaking directly to the sales staff about unconscious biases and the damaging impact of stereotyping. The work was difficult, but it was rewarding. Every day, she could feel the momentum building, the excitement of creating a tangible difference. But despite all the progress, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her fight had only just begun. There were still far too many places like the dealership that upheld practices of exclusion and judgment, places where people of color were constantly made to feel less than. As the media coverage around the incident continued to grow, Tasha received invitations to speak at conferences and panels across the country. The first invite came from a non-profit organization that worked to combat discrimination in the workplace. They wanted Tasha to speak about her experience and how it had inspired others to stand up against racism. At first, she hesitated. She wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. She had never been the type to chase fame. But as she thought about it, she realized that her voice had the power to amplify the issues that so many people faced every day. The first conference she attended was held in New York, and it was a turning point for her. As she stood on the stage, speaking to an audience of hundreds, Tasha could feel the weight of the responsibility that came with being a voice for so many who had been silenced. She spoke passionately about her experience, about how she had been judged based on her appearance, about the microaggressions she had faced throughout her life. She shared her journey, how she had grown from someone who was simply trying to buy a car into someone who now had the platform to make real change. Her words were met with resounding applause. And when the panel discussion ended, many people came up to thank her for sharing her story. Tasha was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but she was also struck by how many people had been through similar experiences. It wasn't just women of color, there were white women, men of different races, and people from all walks of life who had faced discrimination in one form or another. Tasha realized that her fight was part of a much larger struggle, one that transcended individual experiences and connected people from all backgrounds. That night, as she returned to her hotel room, Tasha sat by the window, gazing out over the glittering city lights. Her phone buzzed with messages, but it was a message from Maya that stood out. "I'm so proud of you, Tasha. You're making a difference. But don't forget, you're not doing this alone. "We've got your back. Keep pushing." The simple words of support brought tears to her eyes. It was easy to feel like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. But Maya was right. She wasn't alone. She had people who believed in her, who stood beside her, and who were ready to fight with her. When she returned to Los Angeles, Tasha threw herself back into the work with renewed vigor. She worked with Stephen to set up regular meetings with community leaders, making sure that the dealership's new policies were aligned with the needs of the neighborhoods they served. They held listening sessions with local residents, gathering feedback on how the dealership could better serve the community. For Tasha, it was crucial that the voices of the people who had been most impacted by racism and discrimination were heard in the process. One of the first major changes they made was introducing a mentorship program at the dealership. It aimed to provide opportunities for people from underrepresented communities to gain experience in the automotive industry. Tasha knew that representation mattered, and she was determined to help create pathways for others to succeed. But despite the progress, Tasha could feel the tension in the air. Not everyone at the dealership was thrilled with the changes. Some of the sales staff were resistant to the new policies, unwilling to let go of their old ways of thinking. Tasha had been prepared for this. She knew that change was never easy. But it didn't make the process any less frustrating. One afternoon, she found herself face to face with Tom, one of the senior sales associates who had been part of the group that had mocked her when she first walked into the dealership. He was one of the few employees who had not been reprimanded for his behavior, and Tasha had made it clear that he needed to change. But that day, as they sat across from each other in the dealership's break room, it was clear that Tom wasn't quite ready to accept the new reality. "I don't understand why we're all suddenly being told how to think and act," Tom said, his arms crossed defensively. "I've been working here for over 10 years, and I've always treated people with respect. I don't need someone telling me how to do my job." Tasha didn't flinch. "Respect isn't something you get to decide for other people, Tom. It's something you earn by treating everyone with dignity. That's the point of these changes. This isn't just about the dealership, it's about creating a culture where everyone, regardless of who they are, feels welcomed and valued." Tom grumbled but didn't argue further. Tasha knew this was a process, not a single conversation. It would take time to change the culture, but she was determined to see it through. Back at her apartment that evening, Tasha sat down at her desk, reading through emails and articles about her involvement in the dealership's transformation. She had never imagined that this one moment, standing up for herself in the showroom, would lead to all of this. But the more she reflected on it, the more she realized how much power one action could have. One decision, one refusal to accept the status quo, could change everything. Tasha had become a catalyst for change, not just at the dealership but in a much larger context. She had sparked a conversation that was bigger than herself, one that would ripple through communities and industries for years to come. As she looked out the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Tasha knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but she was ready for whatever came next. The work she had started was only the beginning. The ripple effect had already begun, and it was growing stronger every day. Tasha had always believed that change, real change, came from within, but as she sat at her desk, looking out over the city of Los Angeles, she realized that the transformation she had sparked was no longer just about her. It was about the people she had inspired, the countless others who had witnessed her stand against discrimination, and the movement that was now gathering momentum. She had always known that standing up for what was right was never easy. The path to change was long, often filled with setbacks and resistance. But Tasha had learned that true power lay in perseverance. Every conversation, every training session, every public appearance, it all contributed to something bigger. She wasn't just changing the culture at one dealership, she was creating a ripple effect that was reaching far beyond the walls of that luxury showroom. The day Tasha had first walked into that dealership felt like a lifetime ago. She had been just another customer, a woman looking to buy a car. But she had walked out of that showroom as something much more, a symbol of resilience, strength, and defiance against prejudice. What had started as a personal battle against discrimination had transformed into a larger fight for justice and equality in a world that often failed to acknowledge people like her. And she wasn't stopping anytime soon. Tasha's inbox was filled with messages from people around the country. Many were customers who had experienced similar discrimination and had been inspired by her actions to speak out. Some thanked her for giving them the courage to confront the biases they had faced, while others reached out to share their stories, hoping that their voices could be heard. Tasha took time to respond to as many as she could, offering words of encouragement and advice. It wasn't just about changing policies, it was about giving people the tools they needed to challenge injustice in their own lives. One afternoon, Stephen Carter called Tasha to give her an update on the progress they were making. "I just wanted to let you know that things are moving forward here," he said. "We've been having some tough conversations, but I think we're on the right track. The new policies are being implemented, and we've had great feedback from both staff and customers. There's still a lot of work to do, but we're committed to making this change lasting." Tasha smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. "That's great to hear, Stephen, but remember, the real work is going to come after the policies are in place. It's about holding people accountable when they slip up, and making sure that respect isn't just a policy, it's a culture." "I agree," Stephen replied, "and we're doing everything we can to make that happen. We're working closely with community leaders to continue the dialogue, and we've already seen a significant improvement in the way people are treated here." Tasha could hear the sincerity in Stephen's voice. She knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was the first step, and it was a step in the right direction. Later that week, Tasha was invited to speak at a national conference on business ethics. The event was being held in Washington, D.C., and it would bring together business leaders, activists, and policymakers from across the country. The invitation was a testament to the impact Tasha's story had had, and it was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. As she boarded the plane to D.C., Tasha reflected on how far she had come. She was still the same woman who had walked into that dealership months ago, but now she carried with her the weight of an entire movement. The thought was humbling, and at times overwhelming, but she was ready for it. She had chosen this path, and there was no turning back. The conference was a success. Tasha spoke on a panel with several prominent leaders in the business world, discussing how companies could create more inclusive and equitable environments for their employees and customers. Her message was simple but powerful. Businesses had a responsibility to foster environments where everyone, regardless of their background or identity, was treated with dignity and respect. She shared her personal story, detailing her experience at the dealership, and how one act of standing up for herself had led to a nationwide conversation about discrimination and accountability in business. As Tasha spoke, she saw the impact her words were having. The room was quiet, the audience hanging on every word. It was a far cry from the dismissive glances she had once received from sales associates in that dealership. Now, she was commanding attention, not because of her car or her status, but because of her conviction and her willingness to fight for what was right. After the panel, Several attendees approached her to express their gratitude for her insights and for sharing her story. One woman, a senior executive at a major corporation, even asked if Tasha would consider working with her company to develop a diversity and inclusion program. Tasha was taken aback by the offer, but she knew it was an opportunity she couldn't ignore. Later that night, as Tasha sat in her hotel room, reflecting on everything that had happened, she realized how much her life had changed. She had entered that dealership as just another customer, looking to buy a car. But now, she had become a voice for those who had been silenced, a leader in the fight for justice and equality. She wasn't just a symbol, she was part of a movement that was changing the way businesses and society as a whole viewed and treated people. But the journey wasn't over. Tasha knew that there was still much work to be done. The world wasn't going to change overnight, and there would be more battles to fight. But she was ready. She had found her purpose. And nothing, not the doubters, not the resistance, not the challenges, could stop her. As she looked out over the city skyline, the lights of Washington, D.C., glittering below her, Tasha smiled. She had driven into that showroom with a goal to buy a car, but she was leaving the conference with something far more valuable, the knowledge that she was part of something bigger. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: this was just the beginning.